Yeah, tonight we're going to talk about defensible space and using Firewise landscaping and what that means to everybody. I used to, a little bit about me. My first career was as a park ranger with the National Park Service. I was one of those people wearing the smoky hats and doing education for people in the national parks. And then I moved over to Boulder County, first their Parks Department, and then I started doing education and outreach with the Wildfire Partners program with Boulder County. As part of my training in the Park Service, I became certified as a Type 2 wildland firefighter in 2002, and then later became certified as a wildfire mitigation specialist through the National Fire Protection Association. And what I ended up doing is I started my own little mitigation consulting business to help homeowners, but also to help organizations that need some assistance with projects they might do with municipal governments and that type of thing. So in terms of my business, Wildfire Advice LLC, so the name says it all. It's to give guidance and advice to people regarding wildfire mitigation. And so sometimes I subcontract, and we've worked with municipal governments, participated on a project in Park City, Utah, as well as the city of Glenwood Springs. But I do also offer individual homeowner assessments. And I have done these virtually. I've done them on site. They typically cover two facets, which I'll touch on tonight, which is home hardening and defensible space. And part of that assessment is you receive a detailed, comprehensive report that outlines kind of priority actions you can take to lessen your wildfire risk. Okay, so I'm sure if you live in Colorado, or maybe there are some people outside of Colorado tonight, you've heard of the wildland urban interface, and frequently the term you'll hear is WUI. And so, the U.S. Fire Administration actually has a pretty good definition of what the WUI is. It's the zone of transition between kind of, if you think of like public lands, like Forest Service or BLM, and then where people are living. And so, this area where these two come together, and you've got all these vegetative fuels that can burn in a wildfire, is considered the WUI. And the interesting thing is, when I moved to Colorado 17 years ago, people kind of thought of it as though those are the people up in the mountains. But, as we've seen how things have changed over the last 10 years, quite a few people who live in Colorado, and in fact, the State Forest Service estimates over half of us live now in areas at risk to wildfires. So I think we had a poll question, Phoebe, before I dive into the rest of this. So this is kind of a personal question for you. Have you worked on defensible space at your home? And so if people want to take a moment to answer this question, I'll just give it a minute so you can all enter your responses, and then we're going to kind of get back to this in a moment.
All right.
All right.
Go ahead, and we got 72%. I'll end that poll.
Okay, great. All right.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, it kind of an even balance there. A little bit of everything. So people who want to learn, some people who have dabbled their toes, some people feel like they could do more, and some people have really done some work. That's great. For those of you who are in the extensively, I encourage you, if you have thoughts during the presentation to share with the group, feel free to put that in the chat because we can all learn from each other. So I want to, and this will be in your resource guide, but I do want to raise that we do have a lot of good resources here in Colorado, and one of them is something called the Colorado Wildfire Risk Viewer. So this is through the State Forest Service. So if you were to go on Google, you could bring up this, and it's an interactive, I just did a screenshot here, but there's an interactive map, and you can literally type in your address, and it will give you all kinds of really good information. And that's what you see on the left here, where it's going to give you characteristics about the landscape and the fire intensity and burn probability and all those kinds of things. So that's a really good resource that can hone it down to specifically where you live. And so I would encourage you to take a look at that. And like I said, I think it's on the resource guide that's going out as well. So I'm kind of already mentioned this a moment ago, but how is the WUI changing in Colorado? Yeah, it used to be considered mountains and foothills, those people living up there. I shared earlier with the host that I live in Nederland, Colorado, so I'm thick in the middle of the WUI. But I actually had a neighbor several years ago, probably about 10 years ago, who moved to Louisville for the express reason so she could get out of the wildfire zone. And we know kind of how that turned out in 2021. So, yeah, it's not just the mountains and the foothills. And now includes the plains, especially communities that are closer to the mountains. And then grassland open space poses a significant risk as well as the forest. And it used to be thinking like, oh, it's just the forest that's going to burn. That's the problem. And then suburban neighborhoods are now at risk, like we saw in the Marshall Fire. So why is wildfire risk so high here in Colorado? Well, I must confess, I grew up in Missouri where it's so humid in the summer times. And one of the things I loved about coming to Colorado when I was a kid is it was low humidity. Unfortunately, low humidity lends itself to drier conditions, which makes fuels more combustible. So not great. We typically often don't get a lot of precip. I think we were a little bit lucky in June and July this year, at least on the Front Range, where we got a little more rain. But now we're squarely in the middle of the dry, hot season. We have a lot of forest, a lot of grasslands, a lot of open space, public lands, all kinds of things that have ample fuels that can burn easily. And then the other piece of the puzzle that we can get because of our beautiful Rocky Mountains is we can get these downsloping winds that really accelerate off the mountains, and that can cause extreme fire behavior. So that the same reason so many of us love living here, which is the mountains and the steep terrain, can also speed up the spread of fires. And just a quick note, as I mentioned, like the WUI and where that is changed. And so I just kind of like to note, what we learned from the Marshall Fire, which was Colorado's most destructive wildfire, and that was in December of 2021. And there were some things that kind of changed people's thinking, like, oh, a wildfire can occur on December 30th. In fact, there have been wildfires that have started in every month of the year here in Colorado, just to let people know that. Yeah, if you have high winds and weather, you can create extreme fire conditions very quickly. That particular year, it was wetter in the spring and the grasses tended to grow taller. The problem with that is while it's great in the springtime and the early summer, it's not so great in the fall when, things tend to dry out. And that particular year, we weren't getting any precip through like October, November, December. And grasslands can be a primary carrier of wildfire just as much as forested areas and roads. I mean, I would have never thought that a fire could have leapt across Highway 36 as quickly as that one did. But, again, we had those extremely strong winds and it just sent embers across the highway and started spot fires. And there you go. And then housing density. So suburban neighborhoods where our homes are closer together can lead to greater property destruction in a very short period of time. Okay, so this webinar incorporates the word Firewise. That's a word we hear a lot. And I wanted to talk about kind of, where that comes from, but an organization or a program, I guess is what I'll say, that you might have heard of, which is called Firewise USA. So Firewise USA is a program through the National Fire Protection Association, and it's meant to assist communities and homeowners in lessening wildfire risk. So there are many Firewise designated communities along the Front Range, as well as in other parts of Colorado and probably in other states for that matter. And these are the parameters of what it would take for your community to become part of Firewise. And that's actually on the resource guide, the link to that, what Firewise is about and what you can do to build have your community be designated as Firewise. And then what is Firewise landscaping? Okay, so, landscaping we think of as a way to kind of, I think of it as a way to beautify the area around my home and kind of make it, pleasing to the eye. And I love gardens. I love, flowers and even vegetable gardens and things like that. So it's a way to landscape that gives your home the best chance of surviving a wildfire. So, like, how can we landscape and still accomplish that goal of having it be a place that's appealing for us, but also providing defensible space? And that means safety for firefighters to defend your home, stopping the progress of fire towards your home, and then intertwining that Firewise landscaping with home hardening, which I'll briefly touch on tonight, so that your home has the best chance of surviving if there is a wildfire that starts in the area. Okay, so another term some of you might have heard is something called the home ignition zone. And the home ignition zone is, how does a fire exactly ignite a home? How does a fire set a home on, a wildfire set a home on fire? And there are basically three main methods. And that's obviously if a fire was burning in the trees or along the ground and it comes right up to the side of your home, it could obviously set your home on fire. Radiant heat, so that's like the fire is burning, the heat is going up, and one of the main vulnerabilities in that case is like windows. So radiant heat can break your windows, and that can allow embers to enter your home and set your home on fire. And then the last one, which I would say for most of our fires in the recent past have been um, the main way that homes have been ignited, and that's ember showers. You'll hear the term firebrands as well. The way I like to describe that is if you've ever gone camping and you've had a campfire and, little shards of sparks come off your campfire, that's what we're talking about. And so when you have a wildfire burning, those, depending on what the winds are doing, those embers can actually blow well ahead of the fire front, and they can land on a piece of your house or in your landscaping bed or whatever and start a fire that way. Um, so this is a little video, hopefully it starts about why defensible space is important. And basically that video, what they did, and I think it was the Insurance Institute, is the people that did this demonstration. They let's see if I can get my slide to keep going. Here, whoops, sorry guys. Whoop. I had a little computer glitch there. Let me go back to my program. Sorry about that. Okay. But I'm going to keep talking while I find my program again. Is they conducted a demonstration where they blew embers onto that sample house. And basically, what that showed is like, oh, it doesn't seem to want to go forward. Sorry, guys, technical difficulties here. Let's try this again. There we go. Okay, now we're back in business. And so this blower blew embers onto the different sides of the house, and the differences between the house were kind of how the house was sited, but also that 5 feet around the house and how it was landscaped and whether it had mulch and that type of thing. And as you could see from the video, it was clear within minutes what the difference was in terms of the house igniting. Okay, so what is defensible space? So defensible space is the area between your house and an oncoming wildfire where we modify the vegetation that is around your house to reduce the wildfire threat. And also thinking about defensible space, as a former wildland firefighter, safety is always emphasized for firefighters. Like they need to hold their safety paramount. And if they don't see that as a safe place for them to defend your home, to fight a wildfire, then they will not do so. So that's another important goal of defensible space. The other thing I always like to emphasize with people is that defensible space, while a lot of times people have kind of a negative vision of that, like, oh, you're going to make me cut all the trees and that type of thing. It actually helps create a healthier forest. These seminars are about being waterwise and, xeriscaping and things like that. Well, we all know we've gone through many droughts here in Colorado and the climate can be very dry. And when you have very dense vegetation, it's hard for trees and shrubs and, grasses and wildflowers to compete because they're all competing for the water and the sunlight and that type of thing. And so dense forests tend to contribute to like a drop in forest health or a drop in, just general health of the vegetation around your home. So I always like to kind of, mention this to people that by working on defensible space, the trees, the shrubs, the landscaping that you have will likely be and remain more healthy because you're taking out some of those diseased trees, you're removing a lot of that density, and you're creating greater access to sunlight and water. Okay, so defensible space, how does it lessen risk? So we kind of talked about the stop ground fires from coming towards your home, reducing combustibility where those embers could land and potentially spark a fire. We talked about the safety for firefighters. And I just want to mention one last thing. I've been involved in a lot of webinars with wildfire mitigation, both on a state level and a county level. And I have often heard fire protection district officials tell me that they've actually seen good wildfire mitigation stop a fire from advancing, like stop it from expanding and growing. So you could be part of the solution in actually putting a fire out, which is a great thing to think about. So the three zones of defensible space that we typically talk about are zone one, which is 0 to 5 feet. Sometimes you'll hear that referred to as the immediate zone. Zone two, 5 to 30 feet, the intermediate zone, and zone three, which is 30 to 100 feet. And there's a plus there because if you are located where there is a steep slope on one side of your property, we will often, if I were to do an assessment at your house, I would expand that zone out beyond the 100-foot area. And this defensible space is going to be different depending on where your home is located. Obviously, if you have a home and you've got 10 acres of land, you're going to have that full 1, 2, 3 plus. But if you're in a suburban neighborhood where your lot is only maybe like a fifth of an acre, your zone two or zone three is going to be on your neighbor's property. So in that case, we really encourage linking mitigation efforts among your neighborhood because it's much more effective in lessening the total risk than if you just do your one house and everybody else is, kind of doing their thing. And then some homes I know are adjacent to open space. If you are adjacent to open space, I would encourage you to check with your local agency, whatever that might be for your county, because some of those agencies will allow some mowing or weed whipping on the open space adjacent to residential properties, and they have specific kind of guidelines or guidance on that. And so don't think like, oh, well, there's nothing I can do because it may well be that if you contact the Louisville Open Space or whoever it might be, they might have that kind of arrangement. Okay, so I'm going to pause there because that was just kind of an overview of defensible space. And now I'm going to get into the specifics of zone one, zone two, zone three. And I did see something in the chat here, so I'm going to pause. Where is the question link? Oh, there it is. It's at the top now. Okay, so just Phoebe posted something and I'll just give it another minute. Does anybody else have a question?
Oh, actually, Leslie, there's a few in the Q&A, not separate from the webinar chat,
Oh,
but
oh,
just
there it is.
yeah,
Thank
yeah,
you.
yeah.
I found it.
No
Okay.
worries.
Okay, so first I see, and I hope I'm saying your name right, Alexandra. How big of an impact do invasive species contribute to fire intensity in grasslands? They can have a fairly, so the one that I'll reference is cheatgrass, is one of those invasives that it's very difficult to eradicate and it spreads quite easily and quickly. So, and it also kind of takes over so other species can't grow there. So, something like that can have a fairly significant impact. And I think the biggest reason for those invasives is because having an impact is because they can just accelerate the spread and the growth so rapidly. And then they can be like cheatgrass can be a fuel that can ignite easily and quickly and fire can spread. So great question. Okay, Michelle. Leave the leaves during autumn to help the pollinators over winter, but now I'm being told this is not good advice because dead leaves. Yeah, that's a great question as well. We do normally recommend, and what I would tell you, Michelle, is kind of think about it as and where the vicinity is to your home. So like I'm gonna be getting into the next section about the 0 to 5 feet, but we do normally recommend removing dead leaves and shrubs and those kinds of pollinator gardens that are right in that 0 to 5 foot, right against your home. And the wooden fence. So here's what I will touch upon wooden fences in the next section. But what I would tell you is, again, it's the wooden fence section that is directly connecting to your home. So like what I'm going to recommend in the next section is the last 5 feet not be wooden. So if you've got wooden fence and it's farther away from your home, I probably wouldn't get too worried about that. But if it's closer to your home, and what advice do I have to help both the pollinators and being firewise? My advice would be maybe have your pollinator garden a little farther away from your home. So that's what I would recommend. That's a great question. Okay, zone 3, 100 plus if steep slope on which side of the slope? So it's really on any side of your home. Although Karen, what I would tell you is our prevailing winds are typically out of the west and southwest. And so, that is a part that I would be much more concerned about than the northeast corner. So it is really all sides of your home that we're looking at that steepness of slope. But, if you've got steep slope on the west or south of your house, that is definitely something we would want to extend your zone 3, because that would be concerning that the fire would be approaching from that area and it's going to accelerate up the hill right towards your house. So great question. Weed shipping. I think I said weed whipping. Jill, thank you for, I might have said, it might sound like weed shipping. I don't know what weed shipping would be. But yeah, weed whipping is a word I use. It is weed whacking. They're all the same thing. It's the thing that with the kind of like cord and you take it out there and show, yeah. But I'm glad you asked that question because I sometimes say weed whipping and some people say weed whacking and they're all the same thing. Um, okay, so I think we're down to Kathy. Our HOA is supposed to follow Firewise recommendations. Well, we were just having a discussion about this earlier. So, I mean, I would love it if HOAs would follow Firewise recommendations. One thing I will say in answer to this question that Phoebe and I were talking about before the presentation started is there has been a lot of legislation on the state level that has issued kind of, I guess the guidance I would say is that when it comes to wildfire mitigation, that can supersede an HOA on certain things. So I cannot tell you all the details of that legislation, but I would encourage you to look that up, and maybe I'll look it up after the presentation and get back in touch with Phoebe. But I mean, personally, I would love it if all HOAs would follow Firewise recommendations, but I don't think they all are. However, the state is trying to be more helpful to homeowners who are in HOAs and, creating this type of, laws or whatever that says, hey, this is going to supersede what your HOA says. So great question.
Yeah.
Oh, junk your junipers. You must be in Boulder County because I'm pretty sure Wildfire Partners is doing a junk your junipers program right now. Best practice. Yeah, I love it, Stacy. And I think that I agree with you. That should be in every HOA, like junk your juniper day. So, yeah, I would highly recommend doing that, on it either, and even if you're not in an HOA, you could do something like a community work day. I know that's something we've done in our neighborhood. And I don't know if you're asking about best practice because we are going to get into junipers in a little bit. So I'm going to hold on to the rest of that when we move to that. Landscape plants. So, Steve, I will in a general way, and I'll give you some examples, but I would tell you the best resource for landscaping plants that are Firewise is CSU Extension has this phenomenal list, which is in the resource guide that Phoebe's going to be sending out to everybody, I think tomorrow. I think that's when
Yeah.
Phoebe's sending it out. And that is the best guide. And they have like tons of plants on there. And it's really great because they have like a little chart and it tells you like what's its combustibility rating or what's its ignition resistance rating or that type of thing. So I will touch on a few tonight, but I would really encourage you to look at that list because they have done such a great job with covering. I mean, there's probably 200, I don't know, there's a lot of plants on there. So that's a great resource. Mowing grasslands, I'm assuming you must also remove the cuttings. Not necessarily, Dan, and I would check with your local agency. I don't even recommend that to people who mow on their own property that you have to remove the cuttings. But I'm not going to say absolutely not because it would be dependent on the agency in that particular county. So I would encourage you to follow up with them. Chips, yeah. Mulch or chips, not a good idea, and I will touch on that in a moment in the next section, but Heron, no, we do not recommend chips, especially within the 5 foot zone and even within the 5 to 30 foot zone. And our HOA and Fairplay has not subscribed to Firewise, but oh, that's great, Jeff. I'm glad to hear that. And maybe they should check into it, like being designated as Firewise. So that is really nice to hear. And somebody else is trying to junk. Oh, contractors. That is a great question, Marilyn. I get this question all the time in my business, and honestly, I still struggle with this, like where to find contractors. Honestly, my biggest thing is I just try to talk to my neighbors. And then I also, if you're on Nextdoor, which is like a social media neighborhood site, a lot of times I've found some assistance through there, like just posting something or looking through that. But that is a continual challenge, I think, in a lot of neighborhoods is where to find contractors to help you with this kind of work. So great questions. Awesome. Love it. Okay, well, let's move on. All right, so the first defensible space zone is the 0 to 5 foot zone. I would say this is the most important zone because it's the last line of defense to prevent your home from being set on fire. So, in this zone, we want it to be non-combustible, whatever that looks like. And I'll give you some examples in the next slides. This also works with the home hardening and to resist ignition through those ember showers because if your embers are blowing onto the siding of your house and then they're just sliding down the side and hitting that zone and it's non-combustible, then you will not have an ignition. But if you have a bunch of pine needles or a bunch of vegetation right up against your home, when those embers are flying through the air and they slide down and start to accumulate at the base, they can smolder and then the fire can start. And then the other thing I love about talking about 0 to 5 foot is that it doesn't matter where you live, everybody's got 5 feet around their house. So, pretty much everybody can do something with this zone. So I use this our term home hardening. So, what I would tell you, like with the programs like Wildfire Partners and the local fire protection districts that will do assessments for you, And what I do personally for folks is this is as important as the defensible space. So I do kind of touch upon it here because you could do all this great work with Firewise landscaping all around your house, but then you've got this house that has like a shake shingle roof or gaps in your siding or, vents where embers can get in. So you've done all this fabulous work in the 100 feet around your house, but there's vulnerabilities in the side of your house that can allow embers to get inside your house and start a fire. So I do touch upon this. So if you were building a home today, and a lot of the local counties now require this to use non-combustible materials for siding. So this home you can see has like this nice corrugated metal on the bottom, a product that has really become quite popular, and we have some of it on our home, is hardy board siding, which is really nice because it looks a lot like wood siding, like cedar siding, but it's fiber cement is the materials it's made from, so it's ignition resistant. But even if you don't want to reside your house, you can repair the vulnerabilities where embers can get in. So that's like looking for cracks in your siding, looking at your roof to make sure shingles have not come off and exposed plywood, and taking care of your windows, things like that. So in this 0 to 5 foot, when I go do assessments, people will sometimes say, well, I want to do everything I can. So what's the ideal? Well, the ideal would be to have no vegetation in the first 5 feet around your home. That would be the ideal. This home, you can see they've done kind of this really nice little paver barrier around their home, which I kind of like because I personally think it's aesthetically pleasing. There are other things you can do. Kind of lower budget type of non-combustible barrier around your home is doing this pea-sized gravel that you can do around that area, that 5 feet around your home. Some people have done like these little terraced beds where they do like container gardens, which is kind of nice because that's something that isn't permanently there, and you can adjust it if you need to. Like if you're like, oh, hey, it's fire restrictions, I think I'm going to move those containers farther away from my house now, or that type of thing. So kind of like that idea as well. So it can be budget friendly, it can be simple, it can be as simple as a concrete walkway. You can make it more visually pleasing. There are various ways to accomplish this, but that would be the ideal. When can vegetation be lower risk? So, if you do have that non-combustible siding, then it would be lower risk to have vegetation around your house. Your windows are a vulnerability. So if all your windows are multi-pane or tempered glass, that would lessen some of your risk. And then you're using that Firewise vegetation, which I will kind of touch upon in the next couple of slides. And then also your vegetation in the next zone is minimal and ignition resistant. So in other words, like, oh, okay, it might be okay to do some vegetation in this zone because in the 5 to 30 feet zone, you don't have any conifers. You only have deciduous trees, and your grasses are nice and mowed and low and that type of thing. So trees in the immediate zone. I get this question a lot, and you'll hear some people say, "Oh, it's okay because it's like part of the house." I personally don't like having trees in the immediate zone. And there's a few reasons. One, the obvious reason is you have a large source of fuel right next to your house, and that doesn't seem like a good idea. But in addition to that, needles and branches can drop on your roof and get in your gutters and accumulate against your base of walls. So, like you would have constant maintenance to try and, keep things at a lesser risk if you have a tree. And then we absolutely don't want trees touching the roof or touching the sides of the house. So then you're going to have to prune your tree. And sometimes the amount of pruning you would have to do no longer makes your tree very healthy. So in the end, what I recommend for people is just not to have any trees in that 5 foot zone. Once we get past 5 feet, then you can have trees, and we'll talk about what that looks like. So, so this is just my little rudimentary drawing I came up with to explain, kind of the do's for vegetation. So low growing, ignition resistant, again, take a look at that CSU extension list. They have some great recommendations too that come to mind for me are like something called stone crop, prickly pear, succulents are great. Things that stay low to the ground that are going to grow like wild and woody. Planting between windows. So we don't want to plant underneath the window because then you're providing, that radiant heat that could break your window. And then the bed that you're planting in would be a gravel or stone or something like that, a xeriscaping kind of look is what we're going for. So somebody asked this question. These are just some general do's, but and I actually have if anybody wants to quickly write that down or copy and paste it into the chat, but it's going to be in the resource guide you'll get. So low oil or resin content, high moisture content, compact growth, so something that grows more horizontal rather than vertical, something less woody, drought tolerant, and that's good for all purposes of what Resource Central and Waterwise is about. And so I already mentioned like stone crop and prickly pear. We actually have stone crop growing naturally on our property, so that's kind of nice. So those would be some examples, but those are some general do's for vegetation in that zone. And these are some just do's and don'ts for the immediate zone overall. So non-combustible, if you do use that gravel barrier, you're probably going to want to use some sort of landscape fabric or weed barrier. Because if you pour gravel right over the bare mineral soil, in all likelihood, you're going to get weeds growing into the gravel within the year. So that would be a recommendation to use that. And then 3/4 inch gravel, sometimes you'll hear it called pea-sized gravel, is preferred over river rock. I think there's somebody on the presentation tonight that will remember this lovely experience we had working with Wildfire Partners where we tried to put river rock down for someone in the 5-foot zone. And boy, was that a backbreaking job. Because one, it's just a lot more difficult to manipulate, and it's really hard to get the kind of coverage you want to because these round little stones and so there's like a lot of soil and things showing through it. So I would recommend that 3/4 inch or pea-sized gravel. And you can absolutely do pavers, brick, concrete, any kind of hardscape. They all work well. So if you do want to kind of be more artistic and more functional, any of those kinds of things would work. A couple more don'ts. This is actually from a neighbor of mine who like to stack things alongside their house. We don't want you to be stacking things like tires or construction materials or your old deck boards or firewood or things like that, because these are all combustible items. So again, thinking about either that ground fire or those ember showers that are hitting the side of your house, if you have these combustible items that are lying on the ground, then in all likelihood they're going to ignite and then your house will be on fire. So again, I mentioned removing trees. Be mindful of needle cast too. So, even if your trees are not up against your house, but they are in the 50 feet around your house. This is the case for me. I live in Nutterland. It's super windy. We get needles accumulating all the time against the house. So I find like either using a blower or a leaf sucker is really good for cleaning up those. So you might have to keep an eye on that. And somebody talked about chips, mulch. Definitely don't want that because that's again that very combustible type fuel. In fact, that video I showed you about why defensible space is important, the one side of the house that ignited had all kinds of mulch surrounding the house. Firewood. So um, a lot of us have wood stoves, no matter where you live, whether you live down below or you live in the foothills or whatever. Firewood is another one of those items that, if the embers are smoldering on top of your firewood pile, then pretty soon you have a pretty intense fire that's burning at the base of your walls. So we don't want your firewood stacked in the immediate zone. I do understand, like I said, we get lots of snow up here. I get it. I don't want to schlep out to the firewood pile and grab firewood like when it's snowing and it's cold outside. So if you do want to keep firewood close to your house, like on your deck or on your porch, what I would recommend is using a non-combustible storage container. I have seen people just use a trash can and just put their wood in there and put a metal lid on top. I have seen people build a hardy wood storage box, which hardy board, excuse me, storage box, which was beautiful and amazing. And so there are many ways to accomplish that. But if you do want to keep it closer by, I would encourage you to do that. The main firewood piles, I prefer to see at least 30 feet from the house. The picture below is not the ideal because as you can see, that firewood pile is directly below two conifer trees. So better to find either like a rocky outcrop or a grassy area that's a little more open, that's level or uphill from your house. So fences, this came up in one of the questions. Not opposed to wooden fences. I have a fence that hasn't, wooden fence posts, but the last 5 feet, would like to see that as non-combustible. So what I did at my house is that last 5 feet, I just put in a metal T-post. And then we have kind of the woven wire type fencing. And so then, no wood that is within that 5 foot zone. But the rest of your fence, it's fine. Although somebody asked about junipers or landscaping along the fence line, we can talk about that in a moment. So. Decks and overhangs, kind of the same idea with the firewood. Don't want to put non-combustible things underneath them. So, your old construction materials or your old tires or things like that, best not to store it underneath the deck. As well as if you've got sort of like bay windows or overhangs, you also don't want to have things like vegetation or combustible materials that are stored directly underneath there. If you want to do kind of next level, ignition resistance, you can even consider under that overhang on that window to the right, applying like some hardy board or something that's non-combustible on the underside. And that gives you like an extra layer of protection. Okay, so that is zone one, and I don't have a pause for questions, but I think I am going to pause because that was a lot. So I'm going to, oh, I did that thing. Let's go back. I was trying to get to there we go. The Q&A. All right.
And I can
Let's,
speak just real quick, Leslie, to
yeah.
Ken's question about does Resource Central support uh,
Oh,
landscaping and water use include considerations for urban conflagrations?
yeah.
Um, we do, and as you're learning, there's a lot more that goes into Firewise landscaping than just plant selection. So in terms of like garden in a box or, our lawn removal programs, things like that, there are definitely considerations, and I will admit, I think there's some areas that we could do a better job of pointing people in the right direction for those resources.
Yep.
But yes, that's certainly a consideration. And also, irrigated lawn and things like that are actually, what I've heard from other seminars I've sat through, is
Yeah.
actually helpful.
Yeah. No,
So,
it definitely is. Yep.
yeah. So anyway, thanks for the question, Ken, and I appreciate any and all nudges to do a better job in like focusing us and focusing our customers in a way to find those sorts of resources better.
Yeah, and you know what? I want to say something really quick. Like I love that Stacy kind of chimed in here with some um sharing some ideas. And I would encourage the rest of you, because like obviously from our poll, a lot of you have been quite involved in doing mitigation. So
Mhm.
you may have discovered solutions that I don't even know about. So absolutely go ahead and throw that in there if you've, come across some ideas. But so Marilyn, we kind of touched upon this the last time, and then Stacy, posted something. I think it depends on where you live. Because I admit in Netherlands, I sometimes have a hard time getting landscaping companies to even come up here, because we don't really have any landscaping companies based. So if you're kind of in an area, probably, Boulder or Loveland or Fort Collins or Denver, That's probably a great option. If you're a little more rural, you might have a few more challenges with finding someone, and that's where I mentioned that I do find that that Nextdoor app can be helpful. I also find talking to my neighbors here in Netherlands, we have our own little forum, little Facebook forum for all the Netherlanders, and people post things all the time, like I'm looking for someone to help me take my junipers out, and then somebody else posts, a suggestion, or I can help you with that, or I know somebody, or so, that is if you're not in an area where there's a lot of contractors around, like that's my general um, suggestion. And Stacy, thank you for bringing up vent screening. I did not include that because I was afraid of getting too long here, but I think we're on amazing track right now. So I am so glad you brought that up. Yeah. So part of home hardening, what Stacy's talking about is most of us have vents on the outside of our house. The ones that I think I see most commonly, like pretty much everyone has a dryer vent. And with dryer vents, you actually do not want to screen them. What you want is what we call a louvered sort of metal system. You've probably seen these before. And what happens, because if you screen a dryer vent, it kind of, I found this out from somebody's house, it actually causes the dryer not to work right. So the louvered metal type that like louvers shut when the dryer's not in use is, and then opens when the dryer's being used. That's what we recommend for dryer vents because almost everybody has a dryer. But then for the other type of vents, as Stacy was mentioning, we do recommend screening. So these are like gable vents and things like that. And what we recommend is 1/8 inch metal screening. So if you are handy, this is something you could probably do yourself. I will tell you that when I worked with Wildfire Partners, my colleague and I went on a little adventure looking for things at various hardware stores so we could do repairs ourselves. And we found out that in many hardware stores, they call this hardware cloth. So just know that if you are looking for metal 1/8 inch screening, you may have to ask for hardware cloth. And I know off the top of my head, McGuckins and Boulder sells it in bulk. So you can actually just, it comes like off a roll and you can just cut a certain piece for what you need and, take it home. I'm sure there are handyman type people that would also do this work if you don't feel comfortable doing it yourself. But that is the recommendation. And thank you so much, Stacy, for bringing up vent screening. That is a great thing to bring up. Okay, Jane, storing gasoline. Yeah. So what I would recommend, and I'm actually going to include something else in this comment because the other one I get asked about a lot is propane tanks, like the ones for your grill. So where you should store, where I would recommend storing gasoline is somewhere like enclosed. So if you have a shed, if you have a garage, that's the ideal. We don't want it just sitting outside. We definitely don't want it sitting in the immediate zone or even in the 5 to 30 foot zone. And yeah, and then you have the comment about propane tanks. So with your large propane tanks on your properties, those we just recommend like removing vegetation like 2 to 3 feet around the propane tanks. There's an interesting thing that came out of propane tanks is they're not as flammable or combustible as originally thought. So I recently did some training with the NFPA and it's so interesting. I can tell you in the 2016 fire up here in Netherlands, there were lots of propane tanks left behind on properties where homes burned down. So those large ones, just really limiting vegetation 2 to 3 feet around the tank, not having overhanging trees, that kind of things. If you're talking about the propane tanks for your like barbecue grill, if you have the time, like I wouldn't get too worried other than close it off when you're not in use. So like if you're not using your barbecue, there's like a valve, crank that shut. Don't leave it open all the time. But in terms of if there was an actual fire and an evacuation, if you had the time, and I don't want you to be like, okay, the firefighters at my house telling me to leave, but if it was like pre-evacuation, I would say if you can move that propane tank away from your home or put it in the garage or shed, that would be the ideal. So good question. Ipe wood. So, Elaine, I'm thinking maybe you have eBay wood on your deck. I'm thinking maybe that's why you're asking that question, because that's where I have seen eBay is on decks. So yeah, I mean it's acceptable. I just would say, um, and just a note on decks. I mean, so the Trex decking and the composite decking that has become really popular, there is a slight boost in ignition resistance, but not as much as people would think. So just because you have a composite deck doesn't mean like, oh, my deck is impervious to fire. That is not true. And no, and yes, we are okay if you've got like Ipe wood. I mean, I would never come to somebody's house and be like, well, you gotta just rip up the entire deck and replace it with a composite, mainly because what have I said? But what I would say is check that to make sure you're not getting little holes or gaps or things like that. So I would say it's something you want to be checking on an annual basis to make sure that there's not areas where the deck can accumulate embers. Dryers. Oh, absolutely, Jane. I'm all for outdoor clotheslines. Thank you for that suggestion. Yes. Yeah, no, great. I will say, like where I live, that probably wouldn't work for a good 6 months of the year because it's too cold. But no, Jane, I'm all for clotheslines. Go ahead, have your clotheslines. Yes. Hardware cloth, good way to keep lives out of areas under the porch. Yes, Gail, I would agree with that. And people even use that hardware cloth to screen their decks. So like that, if you want to screen your deck so that things don't blow underneath there, like have screening from the bottom of the deck down to the ground. I've seen people use that hardware cloth and sort of trench it. And that's a good way to keep the pine needles and the leaves and everything from accumulating. So great suggestion. I love all these suggestions. Um, Artificial turf or rubber tire mulch. Wow. Okay, you have officially stumped me, Michelle. I I don't know about rubber tire mulch. I really don't know about the combustibility nor artificial turf. So if somebody else has some ideas about this, as somebody who's either had experience or in the field of wildfire mitigation, and you have thoughts about that, feel free to post in here because I honestly don't know. I've never been asked that question and I don't know. So great question. Adrian, screen your window wells. Yes, if you have window wells, couple things on those window wells. Don't want the leaves and debris accumulating down in the window wells. So yeah, some sort of cloth or cap would be recommended. I will say if you do that, make sure that you're cleaning the debris off the top of the cap or the hardware cloth. And one more note while we're talking about window wells, in a perfect world, you would want those windows made from tempered glass because you are extremely vulnerable to like ground fire and radiant heat, and tempered glass can withstand temperatures of upwards of 600 degrees Fahrenheit. So tires, no, tires are combustible. So we do not want tires around deck pole foundations nor anywhere in the 0 to 5 foot zone. Oh, thank you, Janet. I knew somebody would have the answer. She says rubber tire mulch is highly flammable, probably because tires are combustible too. So thank you, Janet, for answering that question. Um, yeah, so definitely don't want tires and that makes sense. Rubber tire mulch would be poor choice because rubber tires are a bad choice. Totally makes sense. Thank you for raising that. Stacy is just a font of good information. So kudos to Stacy. And Abby Silver said artificial turf is plastic, i.e. petroleum, so also a bad choice. I knew people would have the answers here. Great. You guys are awesome. Fantastic. All right. And now people are kind of saying hi. Yay. Okay. Let's move on. All right. So let's talk about zone 2 and defensible space and Firewise landscaping. So zone 2 is the 5 to 30 foot zone. So I'm not going to say no conifers, but I would say less conifers or limit conifers. And if you're absolutely not married to a conifer, then just don't have them in the 5 to 30 foot zone. But if you do choose to keep, we call them keep trees. If you do, because you have this beautiful Douglas fir and you really love it, or like, I don't know, somebody gave it to, your grandmother and she planted it there, or whatever the reason is, I would try to keep it isolated. So if there is a conifer or two or that you're keeping, don't put a group together sort of, that would cause more of a robust crown fire. Keep it to one or two and keep them isolated. Deciduous trees are definitely preferred. So, the ones that talking about native species that I love in this area are cottonwoods and aspen. So we love the aspen, we love the cottonwood, and if you want tree screening around your house and that type of thing, especially in this 5 to 30 foot zone, that's what I would encourage you to do. I mean, if you do choose to plant an ornamental, that's your choice. I always prefer native trees, but you can do that as well, but deciduous trees is definitely preferred over conifers. No junipers. We're going to get into junipers here in a moment of why you do not want junipers anywhere around your home in close vicinity. So, again, if you do keep some of those isolated conifers, make sure you're raking up pine needles and duff and maintaining that on a regular basis, because if you've got 2 to 3 inches of pine needles accumulating under your tree, that's where those embers could start the fire and lead the tree or lead the fire up into your tree. The new prescription for weed whipping and mowing grasses in this zone from the Colorado State 4 inches is quite short. It's 4 inches or less. So what that means is when we are having the wet weather in the spring, like we did this year when we had rain in June and July, you're going to have to stay on top of that. I know like at my home, we had to be weed whipping every week, like regularly to if you because the problem is if you let those grasses grow and then it starts to dry out, they are really, really tough to get knocked down then. So you always want to cut when they're kind of green. And that goes back to the irrigated lawn that Phoebe brought up is like an irrigated lawn is yeah, not a bad thing at all to have. Not great from the Waterwise standpoint. Xeriscaping would be better, but from a Firewise standpoint, acceptable. And then surface fuels. So if you've got branches that have come down, we already kind of talked about the mulch, no wood chips. And then ladder fuels, and I don't think I put on here, but I do think maybe I have in the next slide. If you do keep some of those conifers, like one or two of them, we like to see them low limbed. So what that means is removing limbs 6 to 10 feet from the ground. And a great rule of thumb for this is if you're standing next to the trunk of the tree and you raise your hand above your head, if you can remove the limbs from the top of your hand down, that's pretty good. Yeah. So, and then, yeah, shrubs like currant or other woody shrubs that, maybe you have mountain lilac or something like that. That is not something we want directly under the trees, but I'm going to get into a little more details here. So there's that, oh, beautiful aspen growth. This is why I love having the aspen because for that magical moment in September, it's beautiful. Um, Oh, and then that is the other thing I was talking about with the conifers of isolating them. You want to have a break in the tree canopy. So that's another reason not to have several of them together in this zone is because you don't want to have like a more intense crown. And here I have about the limbing up of the trees and removing junipers, but I have a little slide about junipers here. Okay. So why are fire mitigation specialists against junipers? Well, there's a nickname that firefighters have for junipers. They call it the gasoline plant, and it's the oils and the resins in junipers just make it highly, highly combustible, like very easy to ignite, very flashy fuel, like burns intensely, burns rapidly. Their vegetation tends to be dense, and these are a couple of photos because this is usually what you see. You either see the tree variety or you'll see something that looks like this, where it's kind of more like matte or like low lying. Um, And they often can be growing at the base of trees, and that's really bad because then you've got this very, you know, vegetation that's going to ignite easily and, be very flashy fuel, and then it's going to be sending fuel up into your tree. And so there's just nothing positive about having junipers within zone one or zone two. So that's why you see these campaigns that Wildfire Partners and other places are doing called Junk Your Junipers, because that would be just such a worthy goal if we could get everybody to remove their junipers within zone one and zone two. All our communities would be collectively safer. So shrubs. Some of them are kind of like shrubs that sort of grow spontaneously. I have a lot of currant on my property, but some of them you might have planted, like mountain lilac, because who doesn't love the smell of lilacs in the spring? Um, and you can have these shrubs, or I would recommend or be okay with having shrubs in zone two. It's not against Firewise landscaping. But when you do have shrubs, it's best to isolate them, not have them directly under trees, to, have them be a fair distance away from other trees, or even other shrubs, because like sometimes I've seen people have this long line of dense shrubs like leading right up to their home, and especially the woody ones, that's not ideal. So, and then, pruning and maintaining them, we kind of talked about the leaf situation earlier, but you don't want it becoming like this lilac actually looks pretty wild and out of control there, and it's right next to the wooden fence, so not great. And removing those dead stems annually, so kind of keeping it pruned and maintained and removing dead leaves, removing dead stems. And so the recommendation for Firewise landscaping when it comes to shrubs is to space them 2.5 times the height. So if you have a 6-foot lilac bush, then you don't want the next one should be 15 feet away, or 15 feet away from that keep tree that you decided to keep because you really like your beautiful Douglas fir or whatever it is. So that's kind of the Firewise recommendation when it comes to shrubs. Surface fuels. This was actually in the Forest Service land near my house, so hopefully nobody's land looks this bad, because this is pretty bad. But so yeah, dead and down wood. So, we all know what the winters can be like here in Colorado. So usually as you start to move through spring to May, which is Wildfire Awareness Month, you'll often find a lot of branches and, trees that have come down, and, various dead and down wood. And so the recommendation is to pull that up. And this kind of goes back to the healthier forest thing that I mentioned at the very beginning. It's not great if you do want to have that biodiversity in your zone two and zone three. It's not great or, you want to have those native grasses that you're growing. It's not great to have dead and down wood. It's not helpful. And touching upon mulch again, because sometimes people will keep a conifer tree in the zone and they'll surround the base of the tree with wood chips or mulch. Also, not a good idea, because again, you're providing that fertile place for those embers to land and smolder and then set your tree on fire. As your tree drops needles and duff, and you notice those branches and things, you'll want to kind of stay on that through I always think of May as Wildfire Awareness Month. And to me, that's kind of the reminder too, that it's like, okay, we're getting into wildfire season full force, because some of our worst fires in Colorado have been in June. June can be very dry and it can get hot very quickly. And so I always kind of think May 1st, okay, this is my time to review my annual list of things I need to do to maintain my wildfire mitigation. And so grasses, so we talked about not having grasses in the immediate zone. That's the 0 to 5 foot, but grasses in the 5 to 30 foot is considered Firewise, maybe not Waterwise, depending on where you live, but definitely Firewise. However, you should keep them mowed and weed whipped while they're green, and try to keep them to that 4 inches or less, especially during the growing season. And we already mentioned this, but again, if your property does But open space, you should check with your local agency, your county, to see if there's permission to mow or weed whip onto the open space adjacent to your house. Okay, I'm going to pause again because we kind of just went through zone two. And I think we're on pretty good track here, Phoebe, because I just have a little bit more. So I think we're in good shape, but I am going to check the questions. I
Sounds
have
good.
property near Leadville. Oh, lucky for you. So beautiful up there. Can you speak to any specifics of high altitude? If I am thinking you mean lodgepole pine when you say pole pine, what to plant? Um, so, uh, Nancy, like my thinking, I've been to Leadville many times. I actually have a couple friends that live up there. And, my thinking is here's where I would go with this. If you do remove that lodgepole pine, and I think that's what you're referring to, what you'll find is that if you have aspen on your property, so I would lean towards those deciduous trees, is what I'm saying. Like, and the ones that are more native. So the cottonwoods and the aspen. And the beauty of aspen is, and I'm sure people probably know this, but aspen clone. So if you can create that opening of, with more access to sunlight and water, you will just get the aspen filling in like crazy. And so that's where I would want to go is remove that density of the lodgepole pine and allow that aspen and or cottonwood to take over or to spread in or fill the gaps or whatever. If you're wanting to plant, and I don't know if we're talking about zone two or zone three. Oh, Sarah, yeah, what we talked about is using let me finish Nancy's question. If you're wanting to plant, I would say using something native, something that fits with that, and that's like the 10,000-foot elevation, so like a subalpine fir or a spruce, something like that is where I would go if you're looking at conifers. But typically in wildfire mitigation, we tell you not to plant. We just say, let nature do its thing. But I don't know what kind of property you have. You may be right in town. And so it may be a little different for you. Okay, Sarah. Yeah, so what we were talking about with dryer vents is just replace, typically your dryer vent is kind of like a little round or square hole on the side of in your siding. And what you want to do is look for like a metal louvered vent that and most hardware stores have these, and or you could order it online. I think we ordered ours online. And so that's what you're looking for is a metal louvered vent that when the dryer's out of operation, those louvers open. And when the dryer's not working, it closes flush shut so that there wouldn't be any embers that could get in there. And if you want, Sarah, you can follow up with Phoebe and I'll even send you a photo of one so you can see what that looks like. Oh, metal roofing. Yeah, Stacy. Um, so when it comes to roofing, what the recommendation is Class A roofing. So a Class A roof, like if you were getting your house re-roofed, you would want to, and frankly, the roofer should know this in this area, but if, just to cross all your T's and dot all your I's, you would want to make sure that you're getting a Class A roof. Now, metal roofs are Class A, but so is asphalt shingle. So really, I mean, like if I had a Class A asphalt shingle roof, I would not go out and re-roof just because I wanted to get a metal roof. There might be like a small 1% gain. And to me, the gain of getting a metal roof is more that, you're not having to worry about shingles coming off and exposing plywood. That to me is the main gain of having a metal roof over an asphalt shingle. But if you have a perfectly good asphalt shingle roof that is not in poor shape, I would not recommend the expense of changing over to metal. And if it would it be best for fire working on recommendations for an HOA? I'm not sure. Would it be best? Are you talking about to get designated for Firewise? Stacy, go ahead and type in some more thoughts on what you mean by best for Firewise. Like to be Firewise? I think that's what you're. Oh, for your HOA. Now I get it. Okay. So yeah, so in terms of your HOA recommendations, Class A roof is what you want. Class A roof. I cannot recommend any roofers. I did what I told you I do with the other contractors. I ask my neighbors. You know, that's what I ask. That's what I do when it comes to contractors. I ask my neighbors. So I have nobody to recommend to you in terms of roofers, although I have seen a lot of good work done in my community. So I'm assuming there are plenty of good roofers out there. Okay. All right, so zone three, this is the 30 to 100 feet plus feet zone. So we kind of already touched on this. If you are sitting on a ridge and you have this steep slope coming down from your house, you definitely want to extend this zone to more than 100 feet. And some of you might say, is it 150, 200? It really depends. I mean, it would be best to have someone look at your site, come to your home and make the recommendation. But if you want to be uber aggressive, I think 200 would probably cover it, but a lot of times 150 is sufficient. And be extremely mindful of those slopes to the west and the south, because that is your danger zone in terms of the direction of fire. But truthfully, fires can do weird things and winds can shift. So any steep slope on any side of your house could potentially be a risk. So grouping and clumping conifers. So in this zone, what you don't want is this continuous density of conifers where it's leading up to your zone two or to your house. So you don't want to be standing out there. And as you walk in a circle around your home and you're looking up at the sky and you can't see blue sky because there's so many trees and they're all just branches are connecting to the next set of branches to the next set of branches. So the recommendation is to group conifers together. So it could be 10, 12, whatever, a group. Um, and then create space in the canopy between that group and the next group. And like here is a group of conifers that you're looking at there. And you can see there's some space on either side of the group. And that's what you want, is to have space in the canopy so that if this group of conifers caught on fire, there's sufficient space that it cannot just jump over to the next group of conifers. Also, if you have natural grassy areas in this zone or meadowy areas or rock outcroppings, those can be used as fuel breaks in this zone. So, you might have like areas already that are a little wet and it's kind of looking more like a meadow, like embrace that and say, oh, this is great. This creates that canopy break. That creates that fuel buffer that I need. Low limbing, we already kind of went over that, 6 to 10 feet. You'll still want to do that in this zone and removing the surface fuels. But we're going to kind of get into a little bit of the details here. So again, zone three, lessen risk, promote forest health. We kind of went over this. So when you're looking at trees to take or keep, you want to kind of maybe keep this in mind, like, okay, I want to be Firewise landscaping, but I also want to have a healthy forest. And so this is something you could keep in mind, like, okay, the first trees I'm going to mark for removal are ones that are diseased or ones that are poorly formed or those kinds of things. Or, so this is something to kind of keep in the back of your mind that, hey, I can promote diversity while also doing defensible space. So there's that picture again, reducing the risk of crown fires, the 8 to 12 trees. So canopy break recommended is 10 to 12, but if you want to be more aggressive than that, on my property, I've kind of embraced it more in the 18 to 25 feet between groups, just to build in a little more, especially on the west side of my house. But you do want to make sure that you can see large swatches of blue sky as you look up. Okay, and then removing fuels, ladder fuels. So same idea as we talked about in zone two. So we don't want little shrubs, little vegetation, wood chips, things like that underneath the trees, because they can ignite easily. And that's why they're called ladder fuels, because then they can bring the fire up into the treetops. And that is not where we want the fire to be. We want to keep the fire to the ground. as much as possible. So as you are cutting trees and you are marking these trees for removal in your zone 3, a couple of things to keep in mind. I thought somebody asked about Ips beetles, but maybe I missed that in a question, but I'm going to talk about it here for a minute. Um, Ips beetle is something that loves freshly cut wood. So if you are cutting trees down, you might want to be thinking about where are you locating those logs in that slash before you remove it from your property. Because if you leave it right at the base of the tree, then you potentially are attracting like Ips beetles to infest your tree. So keep that in mind. So what you can do with this slashed and down wood, a lot of neighborhoods have curbside shipping. So find out Wildfire Partners offers curbside shipping to community groups and HOAs. I know a lot of the other counties have curbside shipping. There are sort yards, or I think they call them something else in Boulder County, they call them sort yards, but I think some of the other counties have another name for them. But basically, it's a place where you can haul your slash and by trailer or truck or whatever means, and you can leave it there. The other option, because sometimes if you've got rugged property and it can be really difficult to remove some of this. And so there is an option to assemble your slash in an open area. And this would be, again, well away from your house. So we're talking zone 3, zone 3 plus, and just staging it there and then getting a burn permit in the winter to burn when conditions allow and the county allows. So, and I am all for that sometimes because some of these areas are so difficult to drag the slash out and so time intensive and difficult to find people to do the work for you and expensive that this can be a viable alternative to remove your slash. So, and then keep in mind those other combustible materials. So we talked about, construction materials. You may have old vehicles. I've seen this too that don't work anymore. I've seen people that had hazardous materials like paint and things like that. These are all things that we do not want just lying around sitting on the ground because they can be fuel for fires to start. So I talked about that forest health. Yeah, when I am looking at defensible space and deciding on trees, I always look at those diseased trees or poorly formed trees first, because one, the tree's not doing well. In all likelihood, it might die anyway. So, why do that? Secondly, if you don't address those diseased trees, they may likely spread to your healthy trees. And again, like I said, the goal with defensible space is not to clear cut everything around your home. I mean, the goal is to make it safer, lessen fire risk, but create a healthier forest. So, if you leave trees that have been infested with mountain pine beetle, they're going to fly and lay eggs to the next tree. And so, something to think about. And if you're wondering like what diseases are like prevalent in your area, the Colorado State Forest Service does a forest health report every year, and they have this really cool map when you go to the website that has like the different parts of Colorado, and you can click on it and it tells you what, and I will tell you for north, like kind of the front range of Colorado, because I just checked this, they are talking about mountain pine beetle making a little bit of a comeback, not on the order of what we had back in the 90s to the 2014, but it is, and I'm seeing more dead lodgepole pine in my area. I will tell you that. And the other one is the tussock moth and the spruce budworm and the emerald ash borer. Those are the ones they noted in the most recent forest health report, at least for the front range of Colorado. So, and then again, if you have a larger property and you have some of those grassy meadow areas, or you have aspen groves that have already taken hold and are growing robustly, you can incorporate them as part of your defensible space and use them as a fuel break. If you have a little seep or a little riparian area, a little creek, a little seep, a little pond, you can also incorporate that. And as a bonus, the wildlife in your area will love you for taking care of that as well, because that provides habitat for them to access water. One note, for zones 2 and 3, don't forget your driveway. Some folks, depending on where you live, driveways can get really lengthy. I know up in my area, people have quarter and half-mile long driveways. It does no good if you've done an amazing job of mitigating around your house, but then your driveway is like crazy with vegetation. So, when firefighters are responding to defend homes, there are requirements for driveways, like in terms of height and width of an engine to get back to your home. And if your trees are growing, two things, where they can't get the engine through, but B, obviously, if you have a row of junipers along your driveway and they are on fire, that is no longer safe access for a firefighter to defend your home. So I would remind you to go ahead and take a look at your driveway, especially if you have a lengthier driveway, to make sure that you're mitigating your driveway accordingly as well. Okay, I'm pausing again, and we're almost at the end. We're right on track. I just have a couple little reminders, but I think we're in good shape. Okay, let's see.
Someone was asking about gutter covers. Is that something that you generally recommend?
I do not recommend gutter covers, and I'll tell you why. Because it feels like, especially those wire ones, the needles just sort of get trapped and stuck and everything. So you're still having to go up and do something about the debris and the needles. I guess it's maybe a little better because like you can grab them, but I just kind of feel like with gutter covers, it lulls people into like, oh, it's okay. Now I don't have to do any maintenance on my gutters and check the debris. And so that's why I don't personally recommend them.
Yeah.
So experience with CSFS fire mitigation grants. I will tell you this, Stacy, I don't have a lot of experience other than like I think I worked with one group, but I'm glad Stacy put in this question because the applications are now open. So this Colorado State Forest Service, I forget how much money it is, but there's a good chunk of money that fire protection districts, HOAs, other community groups can get to help with their community, and those applications are now open. And so I don't have a ton of grant writing skills, but maybe somebody else here does. Does a conifer growing? Yeah. Oh, great question, Kathy. So if you have a leaning tree, especially if the roots are coming up, I would put that in that tree needs to be taken down. Yeah, because it's a risk of falling anyway, like through wind events and other things. So yeah, I would definitely include that in my remove that tree. Mountain pine beetle devastation is increasing fire risk. Yep, absolutely. I would agree with that. Um, yeah, so that's why it's so important to really take a close look at your zone 2 and 3 for any kind of insect infestation. Boy, I'm having a hard time saying that. A control burn for meadows. Gosh, I have no thoughts on that, Jane. That's a great question. I really, yeah. I mean, I guess you could look at it as kind of a way of mitigating grasslands, but meadows, by their very definition, tend to be wetter and more riparian, so I'm not sure I would feel the need for that, but that's an interesting question. Yeah. And if you don't mind me taking one more minute, Phoebe, I just had a couple slides about emergency preparedness that I just was going to remind people
Yeah, of
about.
course. Do that.
So takeaway message, wildfire mitigation requires regular maintenance. So you always want to be checking for vegetation creep, needle and leaf debris, pruning your woody plants, removing ladder fuels, weed whipping. So it's not a one and done thing. And then emergency preparedness, just wanted to give a shout out with this. If you haven't, please sign up for notifications with your local Office of Emergency Management. And what you can do is whatever county you're in, just type in, Boulder County or Larimer County or wherever it is, Arapahoe County. Update your home insurance. I could do a whole webinar on home insurance. I have done a whole webinar on home insurance, but I would just recommend on an annual basis that you check your home insurance for your coverage. I think they said 70% of people in the Marshall Fire were underinsured. Practice evacuating your home in 15 minutes or more. I haven't done that this year, so I think I'm going to go do that maybe this week. Put together a go bag that's probably 5 to 7 days of clothing, medications, things you need to take with you in the event of an evacuation. Have a plan for pets when you're not at home. So this was one of the heartbreaking things about the Marshall Fire. So talk to your neighbors and your family members and ask them if they can be of assistance if you're not at home to perhaps rescue your dog or cat. And then the final thing that I have as a recommendation, a really cheap thing to do that is a very valuable thing, is to install a proper address marker. And that's what you're looking at here. So metal, reflective, non-combustible, numbers are 4 inches high and can be seen from either direction. This is really helpful to firefighters when they're fighting fires, and your UPS and FedEx and EMS people will love you as well if you do that. So thank you all for being part of this presentation. I have thoroughly enjoyed all the questions and comments.